I am Zuri, 29 years old, and a self-made chief executive officer of a major acquisitions firm. But to my family, I was absolutely nothing. At my father's lavish retirement party, he thought it would be hilarious to introduce me to his wealthy friends by saying I had no degree, no future, and just free rode off the family. Everyone in the room laughed at my expense. I did not flinch. I just smiled, lifted my glass, and said cheers because this is the last time any of you will see me. The room went completely silent. What they did not know was that I already held the deed to their entire fake empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent circles of Black Atlanta meant that appearances were quite literally everything. We lived in a sprawling mansion in the prestigious Cascade neighborhood. My mother, Yvonne, lived and breathed for her social standing. She was a prominent member of her sorority, a former chapter president for Jack and Jill, and the reigning queen of the local church committee. Her entire existence revolved around projecting an image of flawless excellence to the outside world. My father, Elijah, was a commercial real estate mogul who owned a historic chain of community supermarkets. He demanded greatness from his children, but only the specific kind of greatness he could brag about at his exclusive country club. My older sister, Iman, fit their mold perfectly. She went to all the right schools, became a ruthless corporate lawyer, and married Preston. Preston was a white investment banker who walked around our family gatherings with a subtle savior complex. He acted like his mere presence elevated our family status, and my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on because of his supposed financial genius. I was the exact opposite of Iman. I dropped out of Spelman College during my sophomore year because the traditional curriculum was simply too slow for the business empire I wanted to build. In my parents' eyes, dropping out of a prestigious historically Black college made me a total disgrace. They never bothered to ask what I was actually doing with my life or how I was paying my bills. They did not know that the small business projects they mocked had generated the initial capital I used to pivot into commercial real estate. They definitely did not know that I was now the head of Obsidian Capital, a firm specializing in acquiring and restructuring distressed corporate debt. To them, I was just the embarrassing daughter who failed to launch. It was a warm Saturday evening in May. My father was hosting his grand retirement gala at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta. The ballroom was dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering arrangements of white orchids. Hundreds of influential guests, local politicians, and business partners were mingling, sipping expensive champagne and eating gourmet appetizers. I sat quietly at a table near the back of the room. I was wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than my mother's entire custom outfit, though she automatically assumed I bought it off a clearance rack because I was supposedly broke. I watched as my father confidently took the stage. He tapped the microphone, his booming voice instantly demanding absolute attention from the crowded room. He thanked his business partners for decades of loyalty, praised my mother for her unwavering elegance, and spent a solid 5 minutes bragging about Iman and Preston. He called Preston the brilliant financial mind who was securing the family legacy for generations to come. The crowd applauded politely. Then my father's eyes scanned the room and landed directly on me. His proud smile morphed into a condescending smirk. He pointed right at my table, ensuring everyone followed his gaze. "And there is my youngest daughter, Zuri," he said, his voice echoing loudly through the speakers. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence stretch. No degree, no future, just free rides off the family. But I guess every successful family needs to have at least one disappointment to keep things balanced and remind us to stay humble. The entire ballroom erupted into laughter. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare at me with a sickening mixture of pity and amusement. I saw Iman lean into Preston, whispering something in his ear that made him chuckle and swirl the whiskey in his glass. Preston looked at me with this insufferable expression of superior pity, shaking his head slightly, as if my existence was a tragic joke. For 29 years, I had swallowed their insults to keep the peace. I had played the role of the quiet scapegoat so they could comfortably maintain their illusion of superiority. But I was no longer a defenseless girl seeking their validation. I stood up. The heavy fabric of my suit shifted perfectly as I grabbed my champagne glass. I did not run out of the room crying. I did not shrink down in my seat to hide. I walked with slow, deliberate steps straight toward the brightly lit stage. The laughter in the room began to die down quickly, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. My father's smug smile faltered as I confidently climbed the short steps to the stage. Before he could process what was happening or signal for security, I took the microphone directly from his hand. The feedback whined sharply for a second, making several wealthy guests wince and cover their ears. I looked out at the sea of judgmental faces, then turned to look directly at my father, my mother, and my sister. I raised my glass high in the air. A toast, I said, my voice ringing clearly and steadily across the massive ballroom. To Elijah, a man who values a piece of paper and public perception over his own flesh and blood. You wanted a performance for your friends tonight, so here it is. Drink up and enjoy the catering. Cheers. Because this is the exact moment, the very last time any of you will ever see my face in this family again. I handed the microphone back to my completely stunned father, took a sip of my champagne, and turned to walk away. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved a muscle. Nobody breathed. I descended the stairs with perfect posture, but before I could reach the main aisle to leave, my mother materialized out of nowhere. Yvonne grabbed my upper arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging fiercely into my skin. Her eyes were wide with a terrifying mixture of rage and social panic. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she hissed through clenched teeth, deliberately keeping her face angled away from the guests, so no one could read her furious expression. "You drop out of Spelman, you embarrassed this family for years, and now you decide to throw a temper tantrum at your father's retirement celebration. You need to leave right now before you ruin the party that Preston generously paid for." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. My expression was so completely void of emotion that she instinctively let go, taking a small step back. I leaned in very close to her ear, ensuring that only she, Iman, and Preston, who had hurried over to intervene, could hear my next words. "Preston paid for this?" I asked, letting a soft, mocking laugh escape my lips. "Are you completely sure about that, Mom? Or did Preston use the money he secretly pulled from mortgaging the Legacy Commercial Center? You know, the building Dad gave him power of attorney over last month to manage the family debt." Preston's face drained of all color instantly. His smug demeanor vanished, replaced by sheer, undeniable terror. Iman glared at me, demanding to know what garbage I was talking about. Before Preston could formulate a lie to defend himself, a sharp buzz interrupted the heavy tension. Preston looked down at his phone in his hand. The screen illuminated brightly in the dim lighting of the ballroom. I did not need to see it to know what it said, but the notification was unmistakable. "Credit card declined. Please contact your bank immediately." I smoothed down the lapel of my expensive jacket, gave my mother and sister one last genuine smile, and walked out the heavy oak doors into the warm Atlanta night. 3 weeks later, Preston strode into the sleek minimalist lobby of my new office building like he owned the place. He was wearing his usual perfectly tailored suit, the kind that screamed old money and unearned confidence. He bypassed the receptionist with a dismissive wave and marched straight toward the glass-walled corner office. He assumed I was just a low-level employee, probably renting a desk in some shared workspace. He pushed the heavy glass door open without knocking and tossed a crisp white envelope onto my desk. It landed with a soft, arrogant thud next to my coffee mug. "Take it and keep your mouth shut." His voice was laced with that familiar, patronizing tone he reserved exclusively for me and my parents. "Your family is practically underwater. Your dad's ridiculous little community supermarket chain has been bleeding cash for years. I am currently negotiating the sale of the legacy building to a major investment firm to save your parents from sleeping on the street. You do not understand high-level finance, Zuri. Just take the money, stay out of my way, and let the adults handle this. I slowly picked up the envelope, sliding my thumb under the flap. I pulled out a cashier's check made out to me for $10,000. $10,000. A pittance. Hush money designed to keep the embarrassing dropout sister quiet, while the white savior rescued the poor, incompetent black family. I leaned back in my chair, resting the check on the polished mahogany surface of my desk. You really think $10,000 is going to keep me quiet, Preston? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. You think I do not know about the third mortgage you took out on the legacy building without telling my father? Preston laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He leaned over my desk, planting his hands firmly on the wood, trying to physically intimidate me. Iman was right about you. You are completely delusional. She told me to just write you a check and be done with it. She knows I am the only one who can fix this mess. She actually trusts me with the family finances because, unlike you and your father, I actually know how money works in the real world. She knows you people need someone like me to navigate these situations. The audacity of his words hung heavy in the air. The subtle, insidious racism he wrapped in the guise of financial expertise. Iman, my perfect corporate lawyer sister, had handed over the keys to our family's legacy to a man who viewed us as nothing more than a charity project he could exploit. She had willingly blinded herself to his manipulation, prioritizing her proximity to his perceived power over the safety of her own family. You mean she trusts the white man in the expensive suit more than she trusts her own father's business acumen? I replied, keeping my gaze locked on his. Call it what you want, Zuri. It is the truth. Preston straightened his tie, looking immensely satisfied with himself. I am finalizing the deal with Obsidian Capital tomorrow morning. They are a massive acquisitions firm. They are going to buy the legacy building for a fraction of its value, but it will be enough to clear your father's immediate debt. So take the check. Buy yourself something nice, maybe a business course at a community college, and stay away from the closing tomorrow. Your presence would just complicate things. He turned and walked out of the office, not bothering to close the door behind him. I watched him strut past the receptionist, a man completely unaware of the trap he had just confidently walked into. The glass door swung shut. A moment later, my assistant Marcus stepped into the office holding an iPad. He glanced at the door, then back at me, a knowing smile playing on his lips. That was the famous Preston, I assume Marcus asked, setting the iPad down on my desk. In the flesh, I replied. I picked up the $10,000 check, folded it precisely in half, and fed it directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder next to my desk. The machine whined briefly, turning Preston's hush money into worthless confetti. I picked up the iPad. The screen displayed an internal company email, flagged with high importance. The subject line read, Obsidian Capital. Final approval for debt acquisition of Elijah Marcus Holdings. I reviewed the attached documents, verifying the staggering amount of hidden debt Preston had accumulated against my father's property. The numbers confirmed what my team had suspected for weeks. Preston was not saving the family. He was systematically draining their assets to cover his own disastrous investments. I tapped the screen, authorizing the final transfer of funds. The acquisition was complete. Marcus, I said, handing the iPad back to him. Please ensure all the final paperwork is ready for the closing tomorrow morning. I want every single detail of Mr. Preston's financial mismanagement highlighted and tabbed. Consider it done, Ms. Marcus, he replied. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline. Preston thought he was negotiating with a faceless corporate entity. He thought he was outsmarting an entire family. He had no idea he had just sold the family legacy directly to the daughter he had spent years dismissing. Tomorrow morning, he was going to learn exactly how well I understood high-level finance. The sharp ringing of my private cell phone cut through the hum of the Obsidian Capital war room. My lead forensic accountant, Marcus, paused his presentation on the glowing smartboard. I glanced at the screen of my phone. The caller ID flashed my sister's name in bold letters, Iman. The golden child was finally reaching out. I swiped to answer and placed the phone face up on the expansive glass conference table, tapping the speaker button. Before I could even say hello, her voice exploded through the room, sharp and vibrating with barely contained rage. "I know exactly what you are trying to do," Zuriaman spat. "And it is not going to work." I leaned back in my leather chair, gesturing for Marcus to continue pulling up the financial architecture of Preston's shell companies. "What exactly am I trying to do, Iman?" I asked, my tone completely flat. "Do not play dumb with me. Preston came home last night completely stressed out because you went to his office demanding money. He told me you threatened to spread lies about his handling of Dad's real estate portfolio if he did not pay you off. You are trying to blackmail my husband." I raised an eyebrow at Marcus, who silently shook his head at the absolute absurdity of the lie. Preston had spun a desperate narrative to cover his tracks, and my brilliant Ivy League-educated sister had swallowed it whole. "He offered me $10,000 to stay away from the family," I replied evenly. I shredded it. Iman let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You are such a liar. You probably begged him for cash because your little business ventures finally went bankrupt." Preston is saving this family. He is using his connections to negotiate a massive buyout that will keep Mom and Dad from losing everything. But you cannot stand that, can you? You are just jealous because I have a perfect marriage, a flawless career, and actual respect in high society, while you are nothing but an embarrassing dropout. On the smartboard, a complex web of transactions illuminated the room. Marcus highlighted a series of limited liability companies, all registered in Delaware, all funneling back to a single parent corporation managed by Preston. I watched the digital trail of my family's stolen wealth, while my sister continued her tirade. "If you ever approach my husband again, Zuri, I will personally ruin you." Iman's voice dropped to a venomous hiss. "I am a senior corporate partner at one of the top law firms in Atlanta. I will tie you up in defamation lawsuits for the next 10 years. I will bleed you dry in court until you do not have a single dime to your name. You will never work in this city again." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass table. The utter lack of fear in my body made my voice drop to a deadly calm. "You are a senior corporate partner, Iman. That is fantastic. Let us talk about corporate law then." I gestured to one of my analysts, a sharp woman named Elena. She immediately tapped her keyboard, bringing a scanned document onto the main screen. It was a notarized commercial loan agreement. "Since you are such a legal powerhouse," I said, staring at her signature on the digital document, "maybe you can explain why a senior partner would blindly sign a personal guarantee on a high-risk subprime commercial mortgage." The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second before Iman scoffed. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "I am talking about the second mortgage Preston took out on the Legacy building 6 months ago," I said, reading the details straight from the screen. "He used the building as collateral for a massive cash loan. But Preston's personal credit is heavily overextended. No reputable bank would touch him. He needed a guarantor with a pristine financial record and a high-earning legal career. He needed you, and you signed it without reading the fine print, did you not? You just trusted that your financial genius of a husband knew better than you. That is standard spousal support in business ventures," Iman fired back, though her voice wavered slightly. "Preston is reinvesting that capital to maximize the building's sale value. You do not understand high-level asset management, Zuri." "I actually understand it perfectly," I countered. "I understand that if Preston defaults on that loan, the bank does not just take the Legacy building. They take your house in Buckhead. They take your retirement accounts. They take your equity in your law firm. You handed a man who looks down on our family the legal right to completely destroy your life. You are making this up." Iman's voice was rising in pitch, the panic finally bleeding through her arrogant facade. "You are just trying to get in my head. My husband is protecting us. He is the only reason Dad's empire has not collapsed. He is the reason it is collapsing, Iman," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "He is isolating the assets, inflating the debt, and planning to sell the remains to a holding company that he likely has a stake in. He is playing you for a fool." "Shut up," Iman screamed. "Just shut your mouth, Zuri. You are a failure. You have always been a failure. You hate that I married well, and you hate that Dad respects Preston more than he will ever respect you. Do not ever call me again. Iman, I advise you to check your joint bank accounts before you threaten anyone else with a lawsuit, I said. She slammed the phone down. The dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet conference room. I reached out and ended the call, my face an emotionless mask. She is completely blind, Marcus said softly, breaking the tension in the room. She genuinely believes he is the hero. People will believe any lie if the truth destroys the identity they have built for themselves, I replied, pushing my chair back. But we are not here to act as family therapists. Where are we on the capital flight tracing? Elena stepped up to the smartboard. She tapped a series of folders, bypassing the domestic shell companies we had already mapped out. She opened a classified file encrypted with top-tier security that our tech team had just cracked an hour ago. You were right to look past the domestic transfers, Elena said, her eyes fixed on the data. Preston did not just take out that second mortgage to cover bad stock trades. We tracked the bulk of that cash. $2.5 million. He routed it through a dummy corporation in Nevada, washed it through a crypto exchange to obscure the origin, and then wired it directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I stood up, walking closer to the glowing screen. The numbers were staggering. My father had spent 40 years building his real estate portfolio, and Preston had managed to liquidate a massive chunk of its value in less than a year. Who is the primary beneficiary of the offshore account? I asked, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted banking forms. Marcus typed a command into his tablet. The redaction bars on the screen vanished. The name of the account holder was not Preston. It was not one of his shell companies either. It is a personal checking account, Marcus said, reading the details aloud. The account is registered to a Chloe Carmichael. Address listed is a luxury beachfront condominium in Miami, Florida. I stared at the name. Chloe Carmichael. I turned to Marcus. Run a background check. Social media, property records, travel history. Find out exactly who she is. It only took Elena 3 minutes. She dragged a series of photos from a social media profile onto the main presentation board. The images showed a stunning blonde woman in her mid-20s posing on yachts, drinking champagne in expensive restaurants, and lounging on the balcony of a high-end Miami penthouse. Elena clicked on a specific photo from 6 months ago. It was a picture of Chloe Carmichael sitting at a candlelit table in an upscale steakhouse. Across from her, partially obscured but entirely recognizable, was Preston. He was holding her hand across the table, wearing the vintage Rolex my father had gifted him for his wedding anniversary. The caption underneath the photo read, "Celebrating our new beginning. Thanks to my amazing man for the dream condo." The puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. Preston was not just a terrible businessman. He was not just a fraud trying to steal my family's wealth. He was systematically liquidating my father's hard-earned assets and using Iman's pristine credit to fund a secret lavish life with his mistress in Miami. He was preparing to cut and run the second the legacy building was sold, leaving my parents bankrupt and my sister legally responsible for millions of dollars in debt. Ms. Marcus, Elena asked quietly, sensing the heavy shift in the room. Do you want me to forward this file to your sister? I looked at the photograph of Preston smiling with his mistress, funded by the blood and sweat of a black man he secretly despised. I thought about Iman's hostile phone call, her unwavering loyalty to a man who was actively destroying her, and her arrogant threat to ruin me. No, I said, my voice turning to ice. Iman made it very clear that she does not want my help. Keep this file locked down. Prepare the final acquisition documents for tomorrow morning. When Preston walks into that closing room, I want him to think he has completely won. We are going to let him dig his own grave, and then we are going to bury him in it. The heavy double doors of my parents' Cascade mansion were unlocked as usual on a Sunday evening. I stepped inside the sprawling marble foyer, the air thick with the scent of roasted lamb, collard greens, and my mother's suffocating floral perfume. Laughter echoed from the formal dining room. I walked perfectly in step with the rhythmic clicking of my heels against the stone floor. When I turned the corner, I found my mother Yvonne holding court. She was surrounded by three of her most judgmental church friends women who wore silk suits and pearls on a Sunday evening just to drink sweet tea. My mother was in her element, waving a crystal glass of sparkling cider as she bragged. "It is simply incredible what Preston is doing for us," she told the women, her voice elevated to ensure the entire room could hear. "He is finalizing a massive commercial restructuring deal tomorrow. A top-tier investment firm is buying the legacy building. Preston is handling all the complex financial negotiations. It takes a real genius to navigate these corporate waters, and we are just so blessed Iman married a man with such a brilliant mind." "A brilliant mind indeed," I said, stepping fully into the dining room. My mother nearly dropped her crystal glass. Her friends turned to stare at me, their eyes scanning my tailored suit with blatant curiosity. My mother's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a tight, panicked grimace. "Zuri," she hissed, hurrying over to me. "What are you doing here? You were not invited to Sunday dinner." "I am family, Mom. I thought family was always welcome at the table." I looked past her, to where my father Elijah was entering the room, followed closely by Iman and Preston. My father stopped dead in his tracks. He glared at me, then looked at his wealthy church friends, instantly calculating the social damage of throwing me out in front of them. He forced a stiff, unnatural laugh. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence. Have a seat, Zuri, though the main table is full." He gestured dismissively toward a small circular table in the corner of the dining room. It was the overflow table, the place usually reserved for misbehaving teenagers and distant cousins. "That is perfectly fine, Dad," I said, walking over and taking a seat at the small table. "I have a great view of the room from here." Everyone took their seats at the grand mahogany dining table. The domestic staff began serving the extravagant meal, but the tension in the room was palpable. My father cleared his throat and raised his wine glass, demanding the room's attention. He spent 2 minutes thanking the Lord for his blessings, and then immediately pivoted to praising Preston. "Tomorrow is a historic day for the Wilson family," my father announced proudly. "Preston is single-handedly securing our financial future. He stepped in when things got complicated and navigated a sale that will keep our legacy intact. It takes a sophisticated, highly educated man to understand the nuances of commercial real estate. Something some people in this room will never understand." He shot a pointed, derogatory look directly at my corner table. "If you had stayed at Spelman Zuri instead of dropping out to play pretend businesswoman, maybe you would comprehend the magnitude of what your brother-in-law is doing for us." Iman smiled smugly, resting her hand on Preston's arm. Preston sat up straighter, adjusting his designer tie. He looked around the table with the arrogant grace of a conquering hero, accepting his rightful praise from the grateful natives. "It is nothing, Elijah," Preston said with false modesty. "Just basic asset maximization. You have to know how to leverage distressed debt to attract the right institutional buyers. It is high-level finance, but I am happy to carry the burden for the family." I picked up my linen napkin, placing it gently on my lap. "Since we are on the topic of high-level finance," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I am curious, Preston. What is the capitalization rate you projected for the legacy building sale? And how exactly did you structure the capital gains tax liabilities for Dad's portfolio?" The clinking of silverware stopped. The church ladies blinked in confusion. My father frowned clearly, not understanding the terminology, but annoyed that I was speaking. Preston's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He let out a condescending chuckle. "Zuri, let us not bore your parents' guests with technical jargon. It is incredibly complicated. You would need a finance degree to grasp the mechanics of the corporate tax deferments I am utilizing." "It is not that complicated," I replied, leaning forward and resting my chin on my hands. "Actually, it is basic commercial real estate law. If the new buyer is assuming the mezzanine debt you placed on the building, they will naturally demand a massive discount on the purchase price. So did you secure a debt service coverage ratio that protects Dad from being personally liable for the deficit, or are you just letting the bank seize his primary accounts when the sale closes short?" The room went dead silent. The words hung in the air like a guillotine. My father looked from me to Preston, a sudden flash of confusion and doubt crossing his face. "Preston," my father asked, his voice losing a bit of its bravado, What deficit is she talking about? Preston swallowed hard. A visible bead of sweat formed at his hairline. He quickly wiped his mouth with his napkin. Elijah, do not listen to her. She is just throwing out buzzwords she read on the internet to sound smart. She is a dropout. I have everything completely under control. The buyer is absorbing the liabilities through a shell company transfer. A shell company transfer, I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Fascinating strategy. Are you using a Delaware LLC or a Nevada holding corporation for that? Because if you are routing the liabilities offshore, say to a bank in the Cayman Islands, that triggers a mandatory federal audit under the new SEC regulations. Preston went completely pale. His eyes darted toward me wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. His jaw tightened so hard I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at me, realizing in real time that I knew exactly what he was doing. Zuri, shut your mouth, Iman snapped, slamming her hand down on the table. You are just jealous. You sit over there with nothing, trying to ruin a celebratory dinner because you cannot stand that my husband is a success. You are embarrassing yourself. Iman is right, my mother chimed in hastily, desperate to save face in front of her friends. Zuri, you are being incredibly disrespectful. Preston is a certified investment banker. You have no right to question his methods. Now eat your dinner and be quiet or leave. My apologies, I said smoothly, picking up my fork. I was just trying to make dinner conversation. I will leave the high-level finance to the experts. The rest of the dinner was agonizingly tense. Preston barely touched his food. He kept stealing paranoid glances in my direction, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. He was mentally scrambling, wondering how much I actually knew and how I knew it. As the domestic staff began clearing the main course to serve dessert, I noticed Preston's expensive Italian leather briefcase resting on the floor right beside his chair. He never went anywhere without it. My investigative team had determined that Preston was old school. He kept his most sensitive digital passwords and physical offshore account tokens written down in a black ledger he carried with him. He did not trust cloud storage for his illicit activities. I stood up from my small table, holding a full-brimmed glass of dark red Merlot. I began walking toward the main exit, a path that took me directly behind Preston's chair. I think I will skip dessert, I announced casually to the room. As I passed Preston, I deliberately hooked the toe of my Christian Louboutin heel around the thick leg of his heavy dining chair. I pitched forward, letting out a sharp gasp. I threw my hand out to catch my balance, and the entire glass of Merlot poured directly down toward the floor. The dark red wine splashed violently over the top of Preston's open briefcase, soaking into the pristine leather and splashing the files inside. "Watch out!" Preston screamed, leaping out of his chair so fast it tipped over backward. "Are you out of your mind, you clumsy, stupid girl?" "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry," I gasped, dropping immediately to my knees on the rug. My heel caught the chair. "Let me help you clean this." "Get away from it!" Preston yelled, dropping to his knees beside me. He frantically began pulling soaked manila folders out of the briefcase, his hands shaking violently. "I said I am sorry," I repeated, grabbing a handful of thick linen napkins from the nearest table and aggressively dabbing at the inside of the briefcase. In his panic to save a soaked legal document, Preston carelessly flipped the leather flap of the briefcase all the way back. There, securely tucked into a hidden clear plastic sleeve on the inside lining, was a small black notebook. Sticking halfway out of the notebook's pages was a white index card. Written on the card in Preston's unmistakable handwriting was an IP address, a routing number, and a complex alphanumeric passcode. "Do not touch my things," Preston shouted, shoving my hand away. "I am just trying to dry the leather," I said, leaning in closer. As I did, I smoothly slid my phone from my suit jacket pocket. Holding it flat against my palm under the cover of the oversized linen napkin, I aimed the camera lens directly at the exposed index card. I tapped the side button twice. The phone captured 3 flawless high-resolution images in complete silence. I slipped the phone back into my pocket in a single fluid motion before Preston even realized my hand had moved. I stood up, brushing off my knees, and looked down at Preston, who was still frantically wiping wine off his precious documents like a madman. "You did this on purpose!" Iman screeched, standing up and throwing her napkin on her plate. "You are psychotic, Zuri. Get out of this house." "It was an accident, Iman. Just a clumsy mistake from an uneducated dropout," I said, my voice dripping with sweet, lethal sarcasm. I looked at my mother, who was clutching her chest in sheer horror, and my father, who looked ready to explode. I gave them a polite nod. "Thank you for the lovely dinner. I will let you all get back to celebrating the family savior. Preston, I strongly suggest you get that briefcase to a dry cleaner immediately. Red wine stains are notoriously difficult to wash out." I turned and walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. I did not look back as I exited through the heavy oak doors into the cool night air. As soon as I slid into the driver's seat of my car, I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. The routing number and the passcode to Preston's offshore Miami account stared back at me in perfect, crystal-clear focus. I smiled, starting the engine. "See you tomorrow morning, Preston." The engine of my car had barely purred to life when a heavy fist slammed violently against the driver's side window. I flinched instinctively, hitting the brakes. The harsh glare of the security lights above my parents' driveway illuminated Preston's face. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled, and the strong scent of spilled Merlot radiated off his ruined suit jacket. He yanked the handle of my car door before I had the chance to hit the lock, pulling it wide open with enough force to rattle the hinges. "Get out of the car, Zuri," he demanded. His voice was no longer the smooth, cultured baritone he used to charm the church ladies inside. It was a vicious, guttural hiss. I slowly took my foot off the brake, shifted the gear into park, and stepped out onto the paved driveway. I stood at my full height, making sure to look down my nose at him. "You are trespassing on my personal property, Preston. I highly suggest you step back before I call the neighborhood security to physically remove you." He let out a sharp, derisive bark of a laugh. He did not step back. Instead, he closed the distance between us, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You think you are so clever, do you not? You think you can walk into your parents' house, throw around a few real estate terms you memorized from a textbook, and suddenly you are a player in my league." I leaned against the frame of my open car door, crossing my arms over my chest. "Your league. Preston, you are drowning in secret debt and sweating through a cheap suit. I do not want to be anywhere near your league." His face flushed a deep, ugly red. The mask of the polite, benevolent son-in-law completely evaporated, revealing the arrogant, entitled fraud hiding underneath. "Listen to me very carefully, you little brat," he spat, pointing a finger inches from my face. "I am the only reason your pathetic family is not standing in a soup kitchen right now. Your father is a dinosaur who ran his business into the ground. Your sister is a desperate social climber who would sign anything I put in front of her just to keep up appearances. And you are absolutely nothing." He leaned closer, dropping his voice to a tone laced with undeniable racial condescension. "You are just another uneducated black girl playing dress-up. You have no degree, no real job, and no power. You are a failure who clings to the coattails of a family name that I am currently salvaging. If you ever disrespect me in front of Elijah again or try to interfere with my business, I will personally see to it that you are blacklisted from every commercial real estate firm in Atlanta. I play golf with the men who own this city. I will crush you." He stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for me to shrink. He expected tears. He expected fear. He expected the quiet, submissive Zuri from 5 years ago, who used to take her mother's verbal abuse without making a sound. I did not blink. I did not move. I just looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Preston frowned, clearly thrown off balance by my complete lack of reaction. "I am warning you, Zuri." "No, Preston. I am warning you." I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. With one swift motion, I swiped the screen awake and shoved it directly into his line of sight. The brightness of the screen reflected in his eyes. It was not the photo of the index card I had just taken. That was locked safely in my encrypted vault. It was the photo my forensic accountant Elena had pulled yesterday. The high-resolution image of Preston sitting at a candlelit table in Miami, holding hands with a stunning 20-something blonde woman. Preston's breath hitched. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. The aggressive posture drained out of his body in a single second. "You want to talk about power?" I asked, stepping forward and forcing him to take a step back. "You want to talk about who owns this city? You threaten to crush me. With what capital, Preston? With the penthouse lease you are currently paying for in South Beach. Or maybe with the $2.5 million you illegally transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under the name Chloe Carmichael." "How?" Preston stammered, his voice suddenly weak and thin. "Where did you get that? Did you really think I was just sitting at the kids' table twiddling my thumbs while you robbed my father blind?" I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that sliced through the humid night air. "You are a walking cliché, Preston. You steal from a hard-working black man, use his brilliant but insecure daughter as a human shield, and funnel the money to your blonde mistress while playing the white savior at Sunday dinner. It is actually insulting how unoriginal you are. You listen to me." Preston choked out, panic completely overtaking him. He lunged forward, reaching wildly for my phone. "Give me that." I smoothly sidestepped him, twisting my wrist out of his reach. He stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the driveway. He caught his balance against the hood of my car chest, heaving, looking at me like I was a ghost. "Do not ever try to touch me again," I warned, my tone dropping to a dangerous register. "And do not bother trying to beg. Your offshore routing numbers, your shell companies in Delaware, and every single wire fraud violation you have committed over the last 12 months are fully documented. I have the entire digital paper trail, Preston." "Zuri, wait. We can make a deal." His voice cracked. The arrogant investment banker was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified criminal realizing the walls were rapidly closing in. "You do not understand. I had bad investments. I got in over my head. If you show that to Iman, she will ruin me. If you show that to Elijah, he will kill me. Just tell me what you want. I can cut you in on the legacy building deal. The buyers are a massive equity firm. We are closing tomorrow. There will be millions on the table. I can wire you 20% directly untraceable. Just delete the photo." I looked at him, feeling a deep, profound sense of disgust. He was willing to sell out his wife, his father-in-law, and his own pride just to save his own skin. He truly believed that everyone was as morally bankrupt and money-hungry as he was. "I do not want your dirty money, Preston," I said, opening my car door and sliding back into the driver's seat. I rolled the window down, looking up at his desperate, sweat-drenched face. "And I certainly do not need a cut of the legacy building sale." "Why not?" he pleaded, gripping the edge of my open window. "It is guaranteed cash. It will save the family." I placed my hands on the steering wheel, looking him dead in the eye. A slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. "Tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock, you are scheduled to finalize the sale of the legacy building with the representatives of Obsidian Capital at the downtown notary office," I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. "I highly advise you to show up on time." "And Preston." He swallowed hard, waiting for my next words like a man waiting for a death sentence. "Wear your absolute best suit," I said softly, "because you are definitely going to need it." Before he could process the statement or ask another question, I hit the button to roll up the window, forcing him to yank his hands away. I shifted the car into drive and hit the gas, leaving Preston standing alone in the driveway, drenched in wine, surrounded by the shattered pieces of his fraudulent empire. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed with the late hour as I steered my car down the winding, tree-lined streets of the Cascade neighborhood. My mind was already categorizing the data I had pulled from Preston, formulating the exact legal and financial steps required for the morning. Then the harsh ringing of my phone shattered the quiet of the car. The Bluetooth display flashed my father's name, Elijah Marcus. I tapped the steering wheel to answer. The audio connected and an immediate barrage of shouting filled the cabin. "You are a disgrace to this family. Zuri, My father roared, his voice trembling with a terrifying, unyielding rage. I invite you into my home out of the goodness of my heart, and you repay me by acting like a feral animal. You humiliated your sister. You assaulted Preston. You poured wine all over his confidential business documents like a jealous, spiteful child. Dad, if you would just listen to me for 1 minute. I started keeping my voice level. Preston is not who you think he is. I saw his ledger. He is transferring your assets. Shut your mouth! Elijah snapped, the sheer volume of his voice making the speakers crackle. I do not want to hear another word of your delusional, fabricated nonsense. Preston is finalizing the deal of a lifetime tomorrow, a deal that will secure our legacy. And you tried to sabotage it because you cannot stomach the fact that he succeeded where you failed. You dropped out. You quit. You are a bitter, uneducated dropout who brings nothing but chaos to our doorstep. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. The sting of his words was an old, familiar pain, but it still burned. I am trying to save you, Dad. You are trying to destroy us, he fired back coldly. But I am putting an end to this right now. You think you are so independent, Zuri. You think you can parade around my house acting like you are above us. I am cutting you off, completely. I furrowed my brow. Cutting me off? What are you talking about? Your bank account, he sneered. The student checking account I set up for you when you were at Spelman. I never removed my name as the primary custodian. I know you have been using it to scrape by. Well, as of 60 seconds ago, I invoked my custodial rights and placed a hard freeze on all funds. Let us see how confident and arrogant you act when your debit card declines at the grocery store tomorrow. You are entirely cut off from the Marcus family resources. Do not ever contact me or your sister again. The line went dead. I stared at the dashboard, a dry, humorless laugh escaping my lips. The Spellman account. I had completely forgotten it even existed. I had stopped using it years ago, keeping a meager $500 balance in it, just because it was tied to an old auto renewal for a software subscription. He truly believed that freezing a dormant college account was going to cripple me. He believed I was still the helpless, dependent daughter he could control with a handful of dollars. I pulled up to a red light and tapped my phone screen, opening my banking app. Sure enough, a red banner flashed across the screen next to the legacy student account, indicating the funds were frozen and to contact the primary account holder. It was a petty, vindictive move. It was meant to break my spirit and force me to come crawling back begging for his forgiveness so I could pay my rent. Instead, it only cemented my resolve. I was not going to beg. I was going to sever the final string he thought he held over me. The next morning, the Atlanta sun was barely cresting over the downtown skyscrapers when I pulled up to the glass facade of First Atlanta Bank. It was the main branch, the financial institution that had managed my father's wealth for decades. I wore a sharp, charcoal gray power suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving style. Today was the day Obsidian Capital acquired the Legacy building, but before I walked into that boardroom, I had a personal errand to handle. I bypassed the long line of early morning customers at the teller windows and walked straight toward the plush, carpeted area reserved for branch management. A young receptionist tried to intercept me, but I did not slow my pace. I need to speak with Mr. Sterling, I said, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Right now. The receptionist stammered, pointing toward a glass-walled office where a middle-aged, balding man sat reviewing paperwork. I did not wait for an introduction. I pushed the glass door open and stepped inside. Mr. Sterling looked up, frowning in irritation at the interruption. His eyes scanned my face, and a spark of recognition lit his features. He knew exactly who I was. He had been my father's personal banker for 20 years. Zuri, Marcus Sterling said, leaning back in his leather chair and folding his hands over his stomach. He offered a patronizing, thin-lipped smile. Your father called me last night. I assume you are here about the frozen checking account. I am afraid my hands are tied, young lady. Elijah is the primary custodial owner. Until he authorizes a release, those funds are completely inaccessible to you. Perhaps you should try apologizing to him. I slowly approached his heavy oak desk, resting my hands flat on the polished surface. I leaned down, looking him directly in the eye. I am not here to beg for $500, Mr. Sterling. I am here to demand that you completely remove Elijah Marcus from my financial profile, effective immediately. Sterling let out a condescending sigh, adjusting his glasses. Zuri, you do not seem to understand how banking works. You cannot simply demand a custodial removal without the primary account holder's consent. Your father is one of our most valued legacy clients. I am not going to violate bank policy and risk his displeasure just because you are having a family spat. Now please leave my office before I call security. I did not move. Instead, I reached into the sleek leather portfolio under my arm and pulled out a single heavily embossed document. I dropped it squarely onto his desk, right over his morning crossword puzzle. Actually, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper. I think it is you who does not understand how banking works. Sterling rolled his eyes and picked up the document. As his eyes scanned the letterhead, the patronizing smile melted right off his face. His posture went completely rigid. The document was a certified proof of funds and a corporate routing authorization from Obsidian Capital, bearing my signature as the sole chief executive officer. I am finalizing a commercial acquisition this morning, I said, watching the color rapidly drain from his cheeks. In exactly 2 hours, Obsidian Capital will be executing a wire transfer of $20 million in liquid capital. I had instructed my financial team to route those funds through your institutional tier, given my family's long-standing history with this bank. Sterling swallowed audibly. The paper in his hand was visibly trembling. However, I continued tapping a manicured fingernail against the oak desk. If Elijah Marcus's name is not permanently erased from every single account attached to my social security number, in the next 60 seconds I will call my CFO right now. I will pull that $20 million deposit route to your largest competitor across the street, and personally ensure that First Atlanta Bank never sees a single dime of Obsidian Capital's money for as long as I live. The silence in the office was deafening. Sterling looked from the document to me, his eyes wide with absolute shock. He was looking at the woman he thought was a broke, helpless college dropout, and realizing he was sitting across from a corporate titan holding the financial equivalent of a loaded gun. 60 seconds, Mr. Sterling, I murmured, glancing at my watch. 55. Sterling practically lunged forward, his fingers flying frantically across his computer keyboard. The sound of his frantic typing filled the quiet room. He bypassed 3 different security protocols, his forehead glistening with a sudden layer of cold sweat. "It is done!" he gasped out, hitting the final key with a loud clack. He spun the monitor around so I could see the screen. "Elijah Marcus has been completely severed from your profile. You are the sole independent owner of the account. The freeze has been lifted." I reviewed the screen, verifying the removal. "Excellent," I said, retrieving my corporate document and sliding it back into my portfolio. "See? I knew we could come to an understanding." I turned on my heel and began walking toward the office door, ready to head to the closing meeting that would determine my family's fate. "Ms. Zuri, wait." Sterling's voice stopped me. It was not the arrogant, dismissive tone from 3 minutes ago. It was hushed, nervous, almost fearful. I paused, looking back over my shoulder. Sterling had stood up from his desk. He walked quickly over to the glass door, checking to make sure the receptionist outside could not hear him. He pulled the door nearly shut and turned back to me, his face pale and grim. "I am violating several confidentiality protocols by telling you this," Sterling whispered, his eyes darting nervously. "But given the capital you represent and the respect I used to have for your father, I feel you need to know the reality of the situation." I narrowed my eyes, sensing the heavy shift in the atmosphere. "What situation?" Sterling let out a ragged breath. "Your father thinks freezing a $500 account was a show of power. The truth is, it is the only account attached to his name that isn't currently deep in the red. Elijah's personal credit cards have been declining across the city for the past 3 weeks. His primary checking accounts are completely drained." My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew Preston was stealing, but the timeline was moving faster than my forensic team had projected. "How bad is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sterling looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my gaze. Preston has leveraged everything. The debt is astronomical. The commercial loan on the legacy building is just the beginning. I do not know how they have kept it hidden from you, but the bank's grace period ended yesterday. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a grim, devastating finality. Ms. Zuri, the Cascade Mansion. We are initiating foreclosure proceedings this Friday. The heavy glass doors of First Atlanta Bank swung shut behind me, sealing Sterling and his panicked revelations inside. I walked to my car with measured, deliberate steps, the morning sun now fully illuminating the Atlanta skyline. Foreclosure. This Friday. Preston had not just skimmed off the top. He had hollowed out my parents' entire financial foundation, leaving nothing but a fragile, rotting shell. He had leveraged their home, their sanctuary, to fund his illicit Miami fantasy. I slid into the driver's seat and gripped the leather steering wheel. I had the power to stop it. I had the $20 million in liquid capital sitting in my newly secured account. I could easily pay off my father's debts, clear the mortgages, and save the Cascade Mansion with a single phone call to my chief financial officer. But saving them now while they still believed Preston was their savior would learn them nothing. It would only validate their lifelong belief that I was a tool to be used and discarded. No, they had to see the savior fall. But there was one person who deserved to see the blade dropping before it actually hit. I pulled my car out of the financial district and drove straight toward Buckhead. Iman spent every Wednesday morning at the Lotus Spa, an outrageously exclusive wellness center that catered to the city's elite. It was a place where wealthy women hid from their miserable realities under layers of mud masks and hot stones. I handed my keys to the valet and walked into the opulent, dimly lit reception area. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and lavender, accompanied by the soft, irritating plucking of a harp playing over the hidden speakers. The receptionist, a young woman in a pristine white uniform, gave me a tight, practiced smile. "May I help you, madam?" she asked. "I am looking for Iman Marcus," I said, bypassing the pleasantries. "I am afraid Mrs. Marcus is in a private session right now, if you would like to wait in the lounge." "I am her sister." I interrupted, my tone leaving zero room for debate. "Which room is she in?" The receptionist hesitated, intimidated by my sharp suit and unrelenting eye contact. "Suite 4, down the hall to your right. But you really cannot go in there." I was already moving. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door to Suite 4. The room was illuminated only by flickering aromatherapy candles. Iman was lying face up on a heated massage table, a plush white towel draped over her body, cucumber slices resting over her eyes. A masseuse was gently working lavender oil into her shoulders. "Leave us," I said to the masseuse. Iman gasped, swatting the cucumbers off her face and sitting up, clutching the towel to her chest. "Excuse me, what is the meaning of this?" I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my pocket and handed it to the startled masseuse. "Take a long coffee break." The woman took the money and scrambled out of the room, shutting the door quietly behind her. Iman swung her legs off the table, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She glared at my tailored suit, her eyes narrowing as she took in my composed demeanor. "Are you completely out of your mind, Zuri?" Iman hissed, reaching for a silk robe hanging nearby. "You followed me to my private spa. You are stalking me now. I told you last night if you ever come near me or my husband again, I will have you arrested. You are a deranged, jealous lunatic." I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic energy. I simply unzipped the sleek leather portfolio I had carried in with me. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs and heavily redacted banking printouts. I walked over to the small table next to her complimentary glass of cucumber water and dropped the stack of documents flat onto the surface. "I am not here to argue with you, Iman. I am here to give you a chance to save yourself before the blast radius takes you down too," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Look at the papers." Iman crossed her arms tightly over her silk robe, refusing to look down. "I am not looking at your fabricated garbage. Preston warned me you would try something like this. He told me you were trying to extort him." Look at the photos, Iman. She turned her head away stubbornly. You are sick, Zuri. You have always been sick. You hate that Mom and Dad look at me with pride while they look at you with pity. You hate that I married a brilliant, successful man who knows how to provide for me while you are scraping by, trying to sabotage my happiness. I reached forward, grabbed the top photograph, and held it directly in front of her face, forcing her to look. Her eyes involuntarily focused on the image. It was the photo of Preston at the high-end Miami steakhouse. He was smiling, looking completely relaxed, holding the hand of the stunning blonde woman in her 20s. The vintage Rolex my father had given him gleamed brightly on his wrist. Iman's breath hitched. The confident, arrogant sneer melted off her face, replaced by a sudden, terrifying stillness. She stared at the photo, her eyes darting over Preston's face, the woman's hand the intimate setting. I let the photo drop to the floor and held up the next document. It was the deed to the luxury beachfront condominium in South Beach. Her name is Chloe Carmichael, I said, delivering the facts with surgical precision. She is 24 years old. Preston signed a 2-year lease on a penthouse for her 6 months ago. The same week he convinced you to co-sign that secondary commercial loan on the Legacy building. Iman shook her head, taking a shaky step back. No, this is a lie. You edited this. I dropped the deed and held up the offshore banking ledger. I mapped the capital flight Iman. He took the $2.5 million from that specific loan, the one you personally guaranteed, washed it through a dummy corporation in Nevada, and parked it in a Cayman Islands account under Chloe's name. Shut up, Iman whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched the lapels of her robe. He is not saving the family, Iman. He is liquidating Dad's portfolio. He maxed out Dad's personal credit lines. First Atlanta Bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings on the Cascade Mansion this Friday. I paused, letting the devastating reality sink into the quiet candlelit room. And because you blindly signed the guarantor paperwork for the Legacy building when he defaults and runs to Miami with Chloe, the bank will seize your house in Buckhead. They will seize your law firm equity. He is leaving you with millions in debt, Iman. He used you. Iman stared at the documents scattered across the floor and the table. I could see the intense, violent psychological battle warring behind her eyes. The truth was staring her right in the face. The evidence was undeniable. But accepting that truth meant accepting the total destruction of her carefully curated reality. It meant admitting that her perfect marriage was a sham. It meant admitting that she, the brilliant Ivy League lawyer, had been conned by a mediocre white man who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient credit score. To admit Preston was a fraud was to admit that she was a failure, and for the golden child, failure was a fate worse than death. Suddenly her posture shifted. The fear in her eyes vanished, instantly replaced by a fierce, blinding delusion. She lunged forward, grabbed the offshore banking printouts, and threw them aggressively back into my chest. You are a liar. Iman's voice echoed off the tiled walls of the spa room, shrill and unhinged. You forged these documents. You hired someone to Photoshop these pictures. You are so desperate, so incredibly pathetic, that you would commit a felony just to ruin my marriage. Iman, wake up, I said, standing my ground as the papers fluttered to the floor around my feet. He is robbing you blind. No, he is not. She stepped closer, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a desperate, frantic need to protect her illusion. He loves me. He is saving this family. You are just trying to poison my mind because you are a miserable, lonely failure. You hate me. You have always hated me because I am the pride of this family. Because Mom and Dad actually love me. Because I did everything right and you did everything wrong. She did not wait for my response. Her hand flew through the air, moving faster than I anticipated. A sharp cracking sound filled the room as her palm connected violently with my left cheek. The sting was immediate, a burning heat that radiated across my face. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. The silence that followed was absolute. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not raise my hand to touch my stinging cheek. I did not blink. I just stared at her, feeling a profound, chilling detachment. She had chosen her side. She would rather burn in a house of lies than stand in the cold light of the truth. Iman stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her hand still hovering in the air between us. She looked momentarily shocked by her own violence, but then her face hardened into a mask of pure, vicious arrogance. Tomorrow morning, Preston is signing the final deal to sell the legacy building to a major investment fund. Iman spat, her voice dripping with triumphant venom. That contract is going to bring this family tens of millions of dollars. We are going to be richer, more powerful, and more respected than ever before. And you are going to be standing on the outside, completely cut off, without a single penny to your name. You are nothing, Zuri. Now get out of my sight before I call the police. I looked at my sister, the golden child so tragically blind to the fire burning down her own house. I let out a slow, cold breath. A dark, terrifying smile curved the edges of my lips. Tens of millions of dollars, I repeated softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. That sounds wonderful, Iman. Truly. I bent down gracefully, picked up my empty leather portfolio from the floor and tucked it under my arm. I highly recommend you attend the closing tomorrow, I said, turning my back on her and placing my hand on the brass doorknob. Preston is going to need his beautiful, successful wife by his side when he meets the buyer. I pulled the door open and glanced back over my shoulder. My smile deepened, sharp and lethal. See you at the notary's office at 9 o'clock sharp, sister. I drove straight from the Lotus Spa back to the Obsidian Capital headquarters. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still burning in my veins, mingling with the dull, throbbing ache radiating across my left cheek where Iman had struck me. I did not bother stopping for ice or adjusting the rearview mirror to inspect the damage. The physical pain was a welcome reminder of exactly what I was fighting against, a stinging testament to the absolute delusion I was up against. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I could not afford to leave a single margin for error. If I gave Preston even an inch of breathing room tomorrow, my family would willingly hand him the knife to cut their own throats. The executive floor of my building was mostly quiet, bathed in the cool, ambient glow of the security lighting. But my central war room was still ablaze with intense, focused activity. Marcus, Elena, and my lead corporate attorney, David, were huddled around the massive glass conference table. They were surrounded by towering stacks of legal briefs, financial disclosures, and digital projections of tomorrow morning's acquisition contracts. They looked up in unison as I pushed through the heavy double doors. David, a veteran litigator who rarely let anything slip past him, immediately noticed the angry, blossoming red mark on my face. He paused, his pen hovering over a document, but he possessed the sharp professional survival instinct not to ask. He simply cleared his throat and tapped the thick stack of papers resting in front of him. "We have the final drafts ready for your review, Zuri," David said, his tone shifting into pure business. "We have structured the commercial purchase exactly as you requested, but there are a few 11th-hour developments from Preston's legal camp that we need to address immediately." I took my seat at the head of the table, pulling the heavy binder toward me and opening it to the primary term sheet. "Walk me through the indemnification clauses, David." Preston is desperate. He knows I have his offshore routing numbers. He knows his Miami penthouse is compromised, but he still thinks he is dealing with a faceless corporate entity tomorrow. He is going to try to slip a liability waiver into the final terms to absolve himself of the fraudulent second mortgage he took out against my father's properties. David nodded, sliding a highlighted page across the smooth glass surface. He tried exactly that. His legal counsel sent over a highly irregular revised addendum just 2 hours ago. They are attempting to quietly transfer all personal guarantor liabilities back to your father's primary estate upon the execution of the sale. If signed as is, Preston walks away clean with the purchase funds wired to his LLC, and Elijah Marcus absorbs the remaining $20 million deficit. The bank would strip your parents of everything they own by Friday. A cold, dark fury settled deep in my stomach. Even backed into a corner, even knowing his mistress and his stolen funds were discovered, Preston was still actively trying to sacrifice my father to save himself. He was going to let my parents lose the Cascade Mansion while he sipped champagne in South Beach. "Did you strike the clause?" I asked, my voice dangerously flat. We did more than strike it, David said with a sharp, predatory smile. We buried a counter clause on page 47, deeply nested within the asset transfer definitions. It explicitly isolates the secondary commercial mortgage as a personal, non-transferable debt belonging solely to the original guarantor and the managing broker, namely Preston. And Iman, I added quietly, staring at the legal jargon on the page. She signed as the financial guarantor on that loan. Marcus looked up from his laptop, exchanging a sympathetic glance with Elena before looking at me. If we execute this contract, Zuri, your sister, is going to be held financially responsible for Preston's massive fraud. When he defaults, and he will, the bank will go after her law firm equity. They will go after her house in Buckhead. She will be ruined. Iman made her choice. I said, my voice completely devoid of hesitation or regret. I handed her the unvarnished truth. I gave her the offshore account numbers. I showed her the photographs of her husband's mistress. I gave her a lifeline, and she chose to slap me across the face to protect a comfortable lie. Obsidian Capital is here to acquire the legacy building and salvage the Marcus family portfolio from total annihilation. We are not here to bail out a woman who willingly funded her husband's betrayals just to keep up appearances at the country club. Keep the clause exactly as it is. Lock them into the debt. David nodded, making a swift notation on the margin of the contract. Done. I turned the page, studying the final signature lines at the back of the binder. What about the buyer identity? Preston cannot know that Obsidian Capital is my firm until the ink is drying on the paper. If he sees my name on the header, he will panic and walk away from the table, and the bank will seize my father's assets by the end of the week. We have cloaked the purchasing entity behind 2 layers of blind trusts and a proxy corporation, Elena confirmed, pulling up a complex flowchart on the smartboard behind me. Tomorrow morning, Preston and your father will be signing the initial transfer agreements over to a generic LLC managed entirely by David's law firm. Your name does not appear anywhere on the preliminary documentation. You will only be required to sign the final binding executive addendum at the very end of the meeting, serving as the ultimate beneficiary. Perfect, I said, closing the heavy binder with a satisfying thud. I want them walking into that notary office believing they are dealing with a standard faceless corporate buyout. Let Preston bask in his false victory. Let my father think his golden son-in-law has saved the day. I want them completely relaxed, entirely unguarded, right up until the exact moment I walk through those doors. As if sensing the mounting tension, my private cell phone buzzed violently against the glass table. It vibrated with a sharp, angry rhythm that I instantly recognized. I glanced down. The screen lit up, illuminating the darkened room, with a lengthy text message from my mother, Yvonne. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the massive block of text. Iman had clearly gone straight to our parents after our violent encounter at the spa, spinning a frantic, highly victimized narrative to protect her fragile ego. I cannot believe the absolute depths of your jealousy. Zuri, the message began, the digital words practically dripping with my mother's signature suffocating disdain. Iman just called me in hysterical tears. She told me you stalked her to her private spa, shoved fake forged documents in her face, and tried to convince her that her husband is a criminal. You are a sick, vindictive girl. I let out a harsh, humorless breath, reading further down the screen. My mother was completely unhinged, clinging desperately to the illusion of her perfect family. Preston is sitting in our living room right now, exhausted from working around the clock to save this family from bankruptcy. He is finalizing a multi-million-dollar deal tomorrow morning to rescue your father's legacy from the bank. And what do? You try to ruin his marriage with cheap lies because you cannot stand that he is successful. You are a stain on this family, Zuri. A bitter, uneducated dropout who cannot stand to see anyone else thrive. I stared at the glowing screen, the words burning into my retinas. A stain on the family. A bitter dropout. After years of bearing the brunt of her condescension, after years of being pushed into the shadows, while Preston paraded around as the brilliant savior, the insults did not even register as pain anymore. They did not break my heart. They just fueled the raging fire that was about to burn their entire illusion to the ground. I am forbidding you from coming anywhere near the notary office tomorrow, the text concluded. If you show your face at the closing, I will personally have security drag you out into the street. Stay away from us. We do not need you. Is everything all right, Ms. Marcus? David asked, gently noticing my intense, unblinking focus on the phone screen. Everything is perfectly on schedule, David, I said, my voice eerily calm. I tapped the reply field on my screen. I did not write a paragraph defending myself. I did not try to explain Preston's offshore accounts, the mistress in Miami, or the impending foreclosure on their precious Cascade mansion. They had chosen their reality. They had chosen the charming white savior over their own flesh and blood. Tomorrow, they were going to have to face the brutal, unforgiving consequences of that choice. My fingers moved swiftly across the digital keyboard, typing out a single, precise response. I never go where I am not invited. But tomorrow, Mom, do not be late. I hit send, watching the message bubble turn blue and deliver. I placed the phone face down on the glass table and looked up at my team, feeling a profound, absolute clarity. Get some sleep, everyone, I said, standing up and smoothing the lapels of my suit. Tomorrow morning we buy a building, and we teach my family a lesson in high-level finance. The downtown notary office was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. Located on the 45th floor of a sleek glass high-rise, the VIP suite offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, while the interior was heavily decorated with dark mahogany polished brass and the scent of expensive leather. Sitting around the massive conference table, my family looked perfectly at home in the illusion of their own grandeur. Obsidian Capital is not an easy fund to pin down, Preston was saying, his voice oozing with a carefully rehearsed false modesty. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, casually adjusting his cuffs. They manage billions in liquid assets. They are ruthless, analytical, and they do not take meetings with just anyone. I had to leverage every single connection I have in the financial district to even get their acquisitions team on the phone. They are notorious for walking away from deals if the sellers show even a hint of weakness. Elijah nodded solemnly, sipping his espresso from a delicate porcelain cup. You did exceptionally well, Preston. You secured the future of the Marcus legacy. This massive influx of capital will completely stabilize our other holdings and allow us to expand. I always knew you had the exact predatory instincts this family needed to survive in the current market. Unlike some people, Yvonne chimed in, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet with a sharp, pointed sigh. She offered Preston a warm, maternal smile that she had never once directed at me. We are just so incredibly grateful you stepped up, Preston. You are the son Elijah always wanted. You actually protect this family. You build things whereas others only know how to tear things apart. Iman sat next to her husband, her posture rigid and perfect. She was wearing a flawless white designer dress, her hair blown out to voluminous perfection, but there was a faint, frantic tension around her eyes. She had covered up the spa incident perfectly, burying the memory of the photos and offshore bank statements I had thrown at her feet. She was clinging to Preston's arm, desperately needing this financial victory to validate her entire existence. Preston worked until 3 a.m, negotiating the final terms with their legal department. Iman said, her voice a pitch too high, desperate to solidify the narrative. He is brilliant, Mom. The representatives from Obsidian were practically begging him to close the deal by the end of the calls. He completely outmaneuvered them. Preston offered a humble chuckle, reaching over to pat Iman's hand. It was nothing, darling. Just doing what needs to be done for the people I love. At exactly 8:58, the heavy oak doors of the VIP suite swung open. The polite, hushed conversation died instantly. I stepped into the room. I was wearing a sharp, tailored black suit with a silk emerald blouse, my hair pulled back into a severe, flawless knot. Flanking me on either side were David, my lead corporate litigator, and Marcus, my chief financial officer. They looked like absolute sharks, carrying heavy leather briefcases and radiating an aura of untouchable, freezing authority. The color drained from Preston's face the absolute second his eyes locked onto mine. He physically recoiled, his knee knocking violently against the heavy mahogany table. His arrogant smile vanished, replaced by stark, naked terror. Elijah slammed his hand down on the table, his espresso spilling over the rim of his cup and staining the polished wood. He stood up, his face contorting with immediate explosive rage. "What the hell are you doing here? Get out, I am waiting for the representative of the investment fund. I explicitly texted you to stay away from here," Yvonne hissed, standing up next to my father, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "You are a disgrace. You are trying to embarrass us in front of the notary staff. Have you no shame, Zuri? We are conducting multi-million-dollar business here, and you have absolutely no right to step foot in this room. You are a stain on this family." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked to the opposite end of the long table, pulled out the heavy leather executive chair at the head, and sat down. David and Marcus took their seats on either side of me, placing their thick briefcases on the table with a synchronized heavy thud. "I am perfectly aware of what is being conducted here, Yvonne," I said smoothly, folding my hands on the table and looking directly at my father. "I am just here to ensure the paperwork is executed correctly." Iman slammed her hands on the table, leaning forward aggressively. "She is trying to ruin this, Dad. I told you what she did yesterday at the spa. She is a jealous, vindictive liar. She wants to sabotage Preston's deal because she is a failure. Call security and have her thrown out into the street before Obsidian's people arrive." Preston finally found his voice, though it was thin and reeked of panic. "Zuri, this is a closed commercial transaction. You have absolutely no business being in this room. You are trespassing. I strongly suggest you leave before things get incredibly ugly." He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, clearly convinced I was about to drop the photos of Chloe Carmichael on the table and blow up his marriage before the ink was dry on his massive payout. He thought I was here to blackmail him for a cut of the stolen funds. He had no idea how completely out of his depth he truly was. "I am not going anywhere, Preston," I replied, holding his terrified gaze with freezing, unyielding contempt. "I told Iman I would see you at 9 o'clock sharp. I am simply keeping my promise." Elijah reached for the sleek silver phone in the center of the table, his face purple with fury. "I am not playing these childish games with you, Zuri. I am calling the building security right now. You are a bitter, pathetic child, and you will not jeopardize the Marcus family's financial survival because of your petty, jealous tantrums." Before his finger could press the call button to summon the guards, the heavy oak doors swung open once more. The closing attorney, a distinguished silver-haired man named Mr. Harrison, walked into the room carrying a towering stack of legal files. He was followed by two paralegals who immediately began distributing thick, meticulously organized binders to the respective seats around the table. Elijah immediately withdrew his hand from the phone and buttoned his suit jacket, forcing a stiff, highly professional smile onto his face as he turned to the attorney. "Mr. Harrison, my deepest apologies for the disruption. We were just about to have an unauthorized individual escorted from the premises. We are fully prepared to proceed the moment the representatives from Obsidian Capital arrive." Mr. Harrison stopped at the center of the table. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked at my father with a blank, deeply confused expression. He glanced down at the top file in his hands, then looked around the spacious room. "Everyone is here," Mr. Harrison said, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent room. He turned his body toward my end of the table and gestured respectfully with an open hand. "Allow me to introduce the legal representative, president, and CEO of Obsidian Capital, the buyer of the family's entire assets." He paused, looking down at the file. "Chief Executive Officer, Ms. Zuri Marcus." The room went completely suffocatingly breathless. The only sound was the sharp metallic clatter of Preston's heavy Mont Blanc pen slipping from his numb fingers and striking the polished mahogany table. It rolled lazily across the wood, falling over the edge and hitting the carpet with a soft, pathetic thud. Yvonne's mouth fell open, her perfectly glossed lips parting as she let out a strangled gasp. She stared at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air, a ghost haunting her perfectly curated reality. Iman froze entirely. The frantic, giddy tension around her eyes morphed into absolute paralysis. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue wrapped in white designer silk. Her hand, which had been resting proudly on Preston's arm, slowly slipped away, as if the fabric of his suit had suddenly caught fire. Elijah blinked rapidly, his mind violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of him. He looked from Mr. Harrison to the thick binder, and finally down the length of the table to where I sat, flanked by David and Marcus. "There is a clerical error," Elijah stammered, his booming voice reduced to a gravelly, uncertain rasp. He pointed a trembling finger in my direction. "She is not the buyer. She is— What are you, their assistant? Did they send you here to take notes? Where is the real principal of the fund?" I did not blink. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and steepled my fingers. I allowed a slow, razor-sharp smile to spread across my face. "No, Dad," I said, my voice resonating with absolute, unshakable authority. "I am Obsidian Capital. I am the principal. I am the sole owner and primary shareholder of the fund that just bought your precious legacy building. And more importantly, I just acquired the entirety of your commercial debt for a fraction of its actual value." Elijah sank slowly back into his chair, as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The formidable patriarch of the Marcus family, the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was a worthless failure, was now staring at his salvation and realizing it wore the face of the daughter he had thrown away. Yvonne shook her head violently, her diamond earrings catching the light as she trembled. "This is a joke. This is some kind of sick, elaborate prank. You do not have that kind of money, Zuri. You live in a tiny apartment. You wear cheap clothes. You are a dropout. Just last night I told you that you were a stain on this family. You cannot possibly be the one funding this." I turned my gaze to my mother, letting the freezing temperature of my stare silence her frantic babbling. "I live modestly because I do not need to flaunt my wealth to validate my existence." "Yvonne?" I replied, my tone clinical. "I dropped out of a program that was wasting my time to build an empire that you could not even begin to comprehend. I have spent the last 5 years creating a financial fortress, while you were busy bragging to your country club friends about Preston's rented Rolex. You called me a stain on the family. Well, this stain just bought your entire legacy." Marcus, my CFO, opened his briefcase with a crisp snap. He extracted a certified bank statement and slid it down the length of the table. It stopped perfectly in front of Elijah. "If you require verification of funds," Mr. Marcus stated smoothly, adjusting his tie, "you will see that Obsidian Capital holds over $200 million in liquid assets, with $20 million currently sitting in escrow, ready to execute this specific acquisition. Ms. Marcus is the sole signatory." Elijah looked down at the paper. His eyes widened, scanning the zeros. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He looked up at me, his expression a chaotic war between awe, shame, and a desperate clinging hope. "Zuri," he choked out, his voice cracking. "You did this. You saved the family. You bought the debt to protect us." I tilted my head, watching him grovel in real time. "Do not flatter yourself, Dad. I bought the debt because it was a phenomenal business opportunity. Preston's gross mismanagement and fraudulent leveraging drove the value of this asset straight into the ground. Your golden son-in-law practically gift-wrapped it for me. I acquired it for pennies on the dollar because the bank knew he was going to default by Friday. I did not do this to protect you. I did this because it was highly profitable." Preston was hyperventilating. Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He looked like a trapped animal, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. He knew the game was over. He knew the offshore accounts, the Miami penthouse, and the fake loans were all sitting in the meticulous files currently resting under David's hands. But Preston was a survivor. A parasite always looks for a way to detach and flee when the host is dying. "Wait," Preston gasped, slamming his hands flat on the table and pushing himself up. "It does not matter who the buyer is. The terms are already negotiated. The contracts are drawn. We just need to sign them, and the transfer is complete." He looked wildly at Mr. Harrison. "Where is the signature page?" "I am the managing broker. I have the authorization to execute the sale right now. Let us just get this done." He reached frantically across the table, trying to grab the primary binder from Mr. Harrison's hands. He was desperate to finalize the deal, banking on the fact that if the sale went through, the money would hit his LLC and he could disappear before anyone realized the liability waiver was the only thing keeping him out of federal prison. David reached out and firmly clamped his hand down on the binder, pinning it to the table. "Not so fast, Preston." Preston's eyes went wild. He lunged forward, his manicured fingers clawing at the thick stack of papers. "This is fraud!" he screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical high-frequency shriek. "She cannot have that money. She is lying. You are all lying. This entire deal is a setup. You cannot do this to me." Iman grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back. "Preston, stop it. What are you doing? Just sign the papers and we can leave." He violently shoved her hand away, nearly knocking her out of her chair. "Shut up, Iman. You stupid, naive woman, do you not see what she is doing? She is trying to trap me." Iman recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth. The illusion of her perfect, loving husband shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. He had just called her stupid. He had shoved her. The polished, charming gentleman was entirely gone, replaced by a vicious, cornered coward. I watched the pathetic display with cold, unyielding satisfaction. I reached into my own portfolio and pulled out a single separate sheet of paper. It was the heavily modified addendum Preston's lawyers had tried to sneak into the final contract just hours ago. The addendum that would have transferred all his fraudulent debt back to my father and absolved Preston of any legal liability. I slid the paper smoothly across the polished wood. It glided over the surface and came to a stop right against Preston's trembling knuckles. "You are the fraud, Preston!" I said, my voice cutting through his hysteria like a serrated blade. "You siphoned $2.5 million of my father's equity to fund a luxury penthouse for Chloe Carmichael in South Beach. You maxed out the credit lines. You put the Cascade Mansion on the precipice of foreclosure. And you thought you could sneak a liability waiver into this contract to leave my father holding the bag while you walked away clean." Elijah's head snapped toward Preston, his face turning an apocalyptic shade of crimson. What did she just say? "You leveraged my house for a mistress." Preston ignored him, staring down at the addendum in absolute horror. He looked back up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. "Please, Zuri," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just sign the waiver. If you sign it, the bank gets paid. The deal closes. Everyone wins. I will walk away. I will disappear. Just sign it." I leaned back in my executive chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I looked at the man who had terrorized my family, who had manipulated my sister, who had mocked me and threatened to destroy my career. I looked at my parents, who had allowed him to do it, and my sister, who had slapped me for trying to warn her. I smiled. "I refuse to sign your legal liability waiver, Preston." The silence that followed my refusal was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only exists in the agonizing seconds before a catastrophic collapse. Preston stared at me, his jaw trembling, his perfectly styled hair now sticking to his damp forehead. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, terrified fraud. I gave Marcus a subtle, barely perceptible nod. My chief financial officer did not hesitate. He unlatched his second leather briefcase with a crisp metallic snap and pulled out a thick, bound manuscript heavily tabbed with red forensic markers. He placed it firmly on the glass table and slid it down the polished surface until it came to a halt directly in front of my father. "This is the complete due diligence and forensic audit conducted by Obsidian Capital over the last 30 days, I said, keeping my voice measured and surgical, letting the clinical reality of the words do the cutting. "When my firm acquires an asset, we track every single liability attached to it down to the last decimal. And what we found hiding in your financial records, Preston, was an absolute masterclass in corporate embezzlement." Elijah stared at the red-tabbed binder as if it were a live explosive. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward, locking my gaze on Preston, who was now visibly shaking in his chair. "Let us walk them through the mechanics of your brilliance, shall we? 3 years ago, you established a blind shell corporation in Delaware. You named it Apex Holdings, LLC, a very subtle touch. Using your position as the primary managing broker for the Marcus estate and exploiting the blanket power of attorney, my father so blindly entrusted to you, you quietly leveraged two of our completely unencumbered commercial warehouses. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. You took out a $2.5 million secondary commercial mortgage against properties my father owned outright. I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the high-rise suite. You did not inject that capital back into the Marcus portfolio to cover operating costs as you routinely claimed during your quarterly reports. Instead, you funneled the capital through a series of proxy accounts. You routed it first to a holding firm in Nevada and then wired it directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure every single person in the room absorbed the gravity of the situation. In the eyes of the United States federal government, I stated coldly that constitutes wire fraud, grand larceny, and a direct malicious breach of fiduciary duty. Elijah reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the audit. His eyes scanned the highlighted bank routing numbers, the forged authorization forms, and the damning offshore deposit receipts. The color drained entirely from his face. 2.5 million. Elijah breathed, his voice barely a rasp. He looked up at Preston, his chest heaving. You told me the banks were restricting our credit lines because of the market downturn. You sat in my study and told me we had a massive liquidity crisis. Preston raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, his eyes darting wildly around the room. Elijah. Listen to me, he stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. It was a bridge loan. It was a temporary strategic allocation of capital. I was moving the funds to secure a massive off-market acquisition that would have doubled our family net worth. I swear to you, I was going to put the money back before the end of the fiscal year. You have to believe me. A strategic allocation. I repeated, tasting the absolute absurdity of the lie. I snapped my fingers without looking away from him. Let us take a look at your off-market acquisitions, Preston. David, my attorney, reached into his portfolio and withdrew a thick manila envelope. He handed it to me. I pulled out a stack of glossy, high-resolution 8x10 photographs and tossed them across the mahogany table. They fanned out perfectly, sliding over the smooth wood and coming to a stop directly in front of Iman and Yvonne. Take a good look at what your husband has been acquiring, Iman. Iman stared down at the photographs. Her perfectly manicured hands hovered over the images, trembling violently as her eyes darted from one picture to the next. There was Preston on a rented 80-foot luxury yacht in Biscayne Bay, a bottle of vintage champagne in one hand, his other arm wrapped tightly around the waist of Chloe Carmichael, who was wearing a tiny designer bikini. There was a time-stamped security photo of Preston walking out of the Cartier boutique in the Miami Design District, handing Chloe a signature red jewelry box. There was Preston lounging on the sprawling balcony of a $10,000 a night penthouse, toasting to the camera, living like an absolute king, while the Marcus family scrambled to keep the lights on in their commercial properties. The denial that had sustained my sister, the desperate, fragile delusion that she had slapped me to protect just 24 hours ago, finally evaporated. The reality was undeniable, printed in high definition and laid bare for the entire room to see. A guttural, agonizing sound ripped its way out of Iman's throat. It was not the pretty, refined crying she usually deployed to garner sympathy. It was the raw, visceral sound of a woman watching her entire existence disintegrate. You promised me, Iman screamed, her voice shattering the quiet professionalism of the notary office. She turned on Preston like a wild animal, her fists flying, striking him indiscriminately on his chest and shoulders. You swore to me she meant nothing. You looked me in the eyes and said the money was tied up in investments for our future. You spent my father's money on this trash. You stole from us to play sugar daddy to a stripper. Iman, stop it! Calm down! Preston pleaded, trying to grab her wrists and scrambling backward in his chair to avoid her blows. It is taken out of context. Zuri is just trying to turn you against me. She manipulated these photos. I ignored his pathetic whining and turned my attention to my mother. Yvonne was staring at the bank statements and the photographs, her face devoid of all color and life. The haughty, untouchable matriarch of Atlanta high society looked entirely hollowed out. She had worshipped Preston. She had held his perceived pedigree and his country club charm as the ultimate trophy, a shiny distraction from her own insecurities. She had weaponized him against me for years, using his supposed brilliance to highlight my supposed failures. "Take a very good look, Mom," I said softly, my voice devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "This is the son you always wanted. This is the brilliant savior you told me I was just jealous of. While you were busy calling me a bitter dropout, while you were texting me last night to ban me from this room, your golden boy was busy bankrupting you. He drained your accounts, he leveraged your properties, and he smiled in your face at Sunday dinner while he did it." Yvonne slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide with a horrified, dawning realization. "If I had not stepped in to buy this debt today," I continued mercilessly, "the bank would have officially foreclosed on the Cascade Mansion by Friday morning. You would have lost the country club memberships, the cars, the reputation. You would have been out on the street with absolutely nothing, all because you trusted a smiling parasite over your own flesh and blood." Yvonne's breath hitched. She pressed a trembling hand over her heart, her mouth opening in a silent, agonizing gasp. She looked at Preston, the man she had defended unconditionally, and saw nothing but the architect of her ruin. She slumped back into her heavy leather chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders began to shake as the reality of her absolute utter foolishness washed over her. Elijah had been sitting in unnerving silence, his eyes locked on the forensic audit in front of him. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was finally piercing through his ego. Preston had not just stolen money, he had stolen Elijah's pride. He had taken advantage of his trust, manipulated his legacy, and made the great Elijah Marcus look like an absolute gullible fool in front of a room full of corporate lawyers. The veins in my father's neck bulged against his stiff white collar. His hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You son of a bitch!" Elijah growled, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal intensity. With a sudden, explosive roar, Elijah kicked his chair backward. The heavy piece of furniture crashed to the carpeted floor. He lunged across the wide, polished table, his hands outstretched, aiming directly for Preston's throat. "I will kill you!" Elijah bellowed, his face contorted in absolute rage. "You stole from my family! I gave you everything! I trusted you!" Preston shrieked in terror. He scrambled backward, his chair tipping over and sending him crashing to the floor. He crab-walked backward against the glass wall, holding his hands up to shield his face as Elijah scrambled over the scattered legal binders, determined to tear him apart. I did not raise my voice, but the freezing absolute authority in my tone cut through the chaos instantly. "Stop." Elijah froze, one knee planted firmly on the table chest, heaving his hands mere inches from grabbing Preston by the collar. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on my leather portfolio. I looked at the broken, shattered remnants of the people who had made my life a misery for over a decade. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but the clean, sharp edge of total control. "Do not ruin your suit, Dad," I said, my voice eerily calm, ringing out clearly in the sudden heavy silence of the room. "And do not waste your energy breaking his jaw, because it is not over yet." I didn't just buy the legacy building. I turned the thick, crisp page of the master binder. The sound of the heavy paper flipping over was deafening in the absolute stillness of the room. David mirrored my movement, sliding a secondary, slightly thinner red folder across the smooth glass surface directly toward my father. Elijah did not touch it. He stared at the red folder as if it contained a live, venomous snake. His chest was still heaving from his aborted attack on Preston, but the violent rage in his eyes was rapidly giving way to a profound, paralyzing dread. Preston's little offshore adventure did not just drain the commercial accounts, I explained, keeping my voice surgical and precise. When he siphoned that $2.5 million, it triggered a cross-default clause deeply buried in the family trust. The bank flagged the missing funds 48 hours ago. They immediately froze your primary operating accounts and moved to liquidate your collateral to cover the deficit. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the table. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, the bank was actively processing the foreclosure paperwork on the Cascade Mansion. They were going to seize the property, auction it off to the highest bidder, and leave you with absolutely nothing. Yvonne let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hand flew to her throat, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the pearls resting against her collarbone. The Cascade Mansion was her entire identity. It was the sprawling estate where she hosted her elite charity galas, the physical manifestation of her superiority over her peers, and the ultimate symbol of the Marcus family prestige. The mere thought of losing it made her sway dangerously in her chair. But the bank did not foreclose. I continued, letting a cold, humorless smile touch the corners of my mouth. Obsidian Capital stepped in. My acquisitions team contacted their distressed asset division before they could file the public notices. We purchased the defaulted mortgage in its entirety. We paid the bank every single cent you owed them, clearing their books completely and assuming total control of the debt. Elijah blinked, a sudden desperate light flickering in his eyes. The realization washed over his face, temporarily erasing the humiliation of Preston's betrayal. He looked at me, his posture straightening just a fraction. He let out a long, shaky breath, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You bought the debt," Elijah repeated, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming relief. He actually managed a weak, trembling smile. "You paid them off. You secured the house. Zuri, you saved the estate." I did not smile back. I looked at the man who had spent 3 decades treating me like an unwanted burden, watching him desperately try to claw his way back to a position of authority. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of a debt acquisition." "Dad," I said, my tone dropping the temperature in the room by another 10 degrees. "I did not pay off your mortgage as a favor. I bought the paper from the bank. That means the debt did not disappear. It was simply transferred." Elijah's weak smile vanished instantly. "I am now your sole creditor," I stated, enunciating every word with brutal clarity. "I hold the deed. I hold the mortgage. I am the legal, absolute owner of the Cascade Mansion. And because the loan is currently in severe default, thanks to your brilliant son-in-law, I have the legal right to initiate eviction proceedings and seize the property by the end of the month. You are living in my house, and you are entirely at my mercy." The silence that crashed down on the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total ruin. Iman was staring at the wall, completely catatonic. Her husband was a criminal, her wealth was a lie, and her entire life was burning to the ground. Preston was still cowering on the floor near the glass window, clutching his knees to his chest, whimpering quietly. But it was Yvonne who reacted first. My mother was a survivalist. For decades, she had maintained her position at the top of the social hierarchy by aligning herself with power and mercilessly crushing anyone who threatened her status. Now faced with total annihilation, faced with the prospect of being thrown out of her mansion and becoming the laughingstock of Atlanta, she instantly calculated her only viable path to survival. She turned to me. The venom and disgust that had twisted her features just 10 minutes ago vanished, completely replaced by a mask of overflowing, tearful maternal affection. "Zuri, my sweet girl," Yvonne cried, pushing her chair back and standing up. She took a step toward me, holding her hands out in a gesture of pure, fabricated warmth. Tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. "I knew it. Deep down, I always knew how brilliant you were." She took another step, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I watched her performance with morbid fascination. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. "You did this to save us," Yvonne continued, pressing her hands to her chest. "You saw that Preston was failing this family. You saw that he was a liar and a thief, and you stepped up to protect your father and me. You bought the house to keep a roof over our heads. You are a true Marcus Zuri, the best of us." "David." My attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly repulsed by the sheer audacity of her pivot. Marcus kept his eyes locked on his laptop, his jaw clenched tight. I am so sorry for everything I said to you yesterday, Yvonne sobbed, taking a step closer to my end of the table. I was just stressed. I was blinded by Preston's lies. But you saw the truth. You saved the family legacy. I am going to tell everyone, Zuri. I will stand up in front of the entire congregation at church this Sunday and tell them that my daughter is the most devoted, brilliant, loyal child a mother could ever ask for. I will tell the country club board how you rescued us. She reached the corner of the table leaning toward me, her eyes pleading for a reconciliation that she had violently rejected my entire life. We can put all this ugliness behind us, Yvonne pleaded, her voice dropping to a soft conspiratorial whisper. You can move back home, Zuri. You can have the master guest suite. We can redecorate it together. We can be a real family again. Just you, me, and your father. We do not need anyone else. She did not even glance at Iman as she casually threw her golden child under the bus. Iman finally looked up, staring at our mother with a look of absolute horrified betrayal. Yvonne was perfectly willing to abandon Iman and Preston to the wolves if it meant she could keep her mansion and her social standing by clinging to me. 10 years ago, this speech would have broken me. 10 years ago, the desperate, unloved teenager inside me would have given absolutely anything to hear her mother call her brilliant, to hear her mother offer her a place in the family. I would have handed over my entire empire for just a fraction of the affection Yvonne was currently faking. But I was no longer that girl. I had built my empire from the ground up, fighting through the dirt and the rejection while they laughed at my struggles. I did not need her validation. I did not need her fake love. I saw right through the tears, right through the church promises, straight to the cold, calculating greed rotting at her core. I looked at my mother. My expression was perfectly blank. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver Mont Blanc pen that Preston had dropped earlier. It felt cool and solid in my hand. I pulled the final binding executive addendum toward me, the document that officially transferred the ownership of all Marcus family assets, including their home, directly into the Obsidian Capital portfolio, under my sole discretion. I uncapped the pen. I am not moving into the guest suite, Yvonne, I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion. And you are not going to tell the church congregation a single thing. I pressed the pen to the signature line. I did this for the money, Mom. Business is business. Preston's face morphed from sheer panic into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The realization that he had been completely outplayed by the very woman he had spent years mocking finally snapped the last fragile thread of his sanity. He lunged across the table, his hands violently sweeping a stack of manila folders into the air. The papers fluttered to the carpet like dead leaves. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. You think you have won, you arrogant bitch? You think you can just march in here and take my life apart? I am a white man in America. Do you hear me? I have a team of defense attorneys who will absolutely crush you in court. They will tie you up in civil litigation for the next 10 years until Obsidian Capital bleeds dry. You are nothing but a bitter, jealous dropout playing dress-up in a corporate boardroom. Preston scrambled to grab his leather briefcase, his hands fumbling wildly with the brass clasps. He knew the money was still sitting in the Cayman accounts. If he could just get out of this building, if he could just get to a secure terminal, he could wire the funds to a non-extradition jurisdiction before my legal team could file an injunction. He was operating on pure adrenaline-fueled survival instinct. I will sue you for defamation. I will counter-sue for tortious interference. Preston screamed, his voice cracking as he backed away from the table and made a desperate break for the heavy oak doors. I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again. You have no idea who you are dealing with. He grabbed the brass handles of the double doors and yanked them hard. They did not budge. David and Marcus had moved with terrifying synchronized precision. Before Preston had even taken his third step, my lead litigator and my chief financial officer had positioned themselves squarely in front of the exit. They stood shoulder to shoulder, two towering walls of tailored wool and cold, unflinching authority. Move out of my way, Preston snarled, his chest heaving as he tried to shove past David. I am leaving. This meeting is over. David did not yield a single inch. He looked down at Preston with the absolute clinical detachment of a scientist examining a dying insect. You are not going anywhere, Preston, David said, his voice echoing with lethal calm. And you are not going to call your defense attorneys to tie us up in civil litigation because this is no longer a civil dispute. Preston froze, his hand still gripping the brass handle. The remaining color drained entirely from his face. What are you talking about? David adjusted his suit jacket, his eyes locking onto Preston. Intentionally concealing a $2.5 million secondary commercial mortgage during the execution of a primary real estate acquisition is a direct violation of federal disclosure laws. Furthermore, routing those stolen funds through Nevada, holding companies into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, upgrades your little real estate scam into a much more severe category. David stepped forward, forcing Preston to stumble backward. You committed federal wire fraud, Preston. It is a Class C felony. Preston's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The briefcase slipped from his sweaty fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. You did not honestly think we spent the last 30 days conducting a forensic audit just to humiliate you at a closing table, did you? I asked, remaining perfectly seated in my executive chair. My voice was smooth, completely unaffected by the manic energy bouncing off the glass walls. I like to be thorough. When Marcus discovered the offshore routing numbers last week, we did not just put them in a red binder. We handed the entire unredacted portfolio straight to the white-collar crime division. Elijah fell back into his chair, his hands covering his mouth. Yvonne let out a low, horrified moan, pressing her face against her husband's shoulder. They were watching the absolute destruction of their golden idol, powerless to stop the implosion. They have been reviewing your transactions for the last 48 hours. I continued my gaze, pinning Preston to the spot. They have the forged authorization forms. They have the wire transfer receipts. They have the time-stamped photos of your Miami expenditures. Your accounts are already frozen. Your passport has been flagged. There is no money left for you to hide, Preston. You are completely, utterly broke. Preston shook his head violently, a high, thin sound of panic escaping his throat. No, you cannot do this. I am a managing partner. I am family. Elijah, tell them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them I was operating under your verbal authorization. He looked desperately at my father, begging the man he had just bankrupted to throw him a lifeline. Elijah did not even look at him. My father simply stared at the mahogany table, utterly destroyed by his own blind arrogance. They are waiting for you in the ground floor lobby, David added, checking his watch with maddening casualness. Though considering you attempted to flee the closing, I imagine they are probably on their way up right now. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors behind David and Marcus swung open with a forceful, commanding thrust. The two paralegals who had been standing quietly in the corner immediately stepped aside. Mr. Harrison, the closing attorney, lowered his reading glasses and let out a long, heavy sigh, stepping back to allow the new arrivals to enter the room. Two towering men wearing sharp, dark suits and grim, unyielding expressions stepped into the VIP suite. The gold badges clipped to their belts caught the glare of the overhead chandeliers. They moved with absolute, terrifying purpose, completely ignoring the luxurious surroundings and the shocked gasps of my parents. Preston Miller, the lead agent, stated, his voice a low, booming baritone that instantly dominated the room. He did not ask a question. It was a statement of undeniable fact. Preston backed away, his hands flying up defensively. Wait, this is a mistake. I have legal representation. I want to call my lawyer. You cannot just barge in here. The agent grabbed Preston by the shoulder, spinning him around with effortless, brutal efficiency. Preston Miller, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and interstate financial manipulation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Preston's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Preston began to sob, his knees buckling as the agents held him up. He looked wildly over his shoulder at Iman. Iman, call the lawyers. Tell them to drain my personal accounts. Tell them to post bail. Iman, do something. Iman stood near the edge of the conference table, her eyes wide, staring at the man she had worshipped. She looked at the handcuffs, the FBI badges, and the red binder still sitting on the table filled with pictures of her husband's mistress. The perfect country club illusion she had sacrificed everything to protect was being dragged out of the room in federal chains. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the thick carpet, letting out a sharp, agonizing wail as the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her husband. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing Preston's frantic shouting from the stunned silence of the boardroom. Iman remained on the carpet, her perfectly styled hair falling over her face as she wept, her pristine illusion of a flawless marriage violently erased. Elijah stared at the closed doors, the reality of his ruined legacy finally crashing down upon him. He turned back to the glass table. The red binders, the bank statements, and the glaring photographs of Preston's infidelity lay scattered across the polished wood, irrefutable proof of his own catastrophic failure. His knees gave out. The great Elijah. Marcus, a man who had demanded total submission from everyone around him, slowly sank to the floor. He ignored his weeping daughter and his paralyzed wife. He crawled forward on the carpet, stopping right beside my chair. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swimming with desperate tears. "Zuri, please." Elijah begged, his booming authoritative voice reduced to a pathetic trembling whisper. "I am sorry. I was wrong. I was so entirely wrong about him, and I was wrong about you. Please, Zuri, you have proven your point. You won. But please do not take my company. Do not take our home. It is my life's work. You cannot take my life's work away from me." I looked down at the man who had spent my entire existence making me feel microscopic. I searched myself for a flicker of sympathy, a single shred of daughterly affection. I found absolutely nothing. "You did not lose your life's work, Dad," I stated, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute finality. "You just lost your arrogance. You handed your legacy to a parasite because he looked the part, and you banished your actual blood because I refused to play the quiet, obedient failure." I reached into David's open briefcase and withdrew a single crisp document. I placed it on the edge of the glass table right at eye level for the groveling patriarch of the Marcus family. As for the legacy building, I continued my tone clinical and detached. It is functionally obsolete. Obsidian Capital is scheduling it for demolition next quarter. We are clearing the site to build a state-of-the-art incubation hub and venture capital center dedicated entirely to funding businesses founded by Black women. Elijah let out a soft, devastated gasp, the final remnants of his pride crumbling as he realized his name would be physically erased from the city skyline. And as for the Cascade Mansion, I said, sliding the crisp document off the table so it fluttered down onto the carpet right next to Elijah's trembling hands. "That is your official eviction notice." Yvonne let out a sharp, hysterical sob from her chair, burying her face in her hands. "You have exactly 30 days to pack your belongings and vacate the premises," I told them. My gaze sweeping over my sobbing mother, my broken sister, and my kneeling father. There will be no extensions. There will be no exceptions. If you are not out by the 1st of the month, I will have the county sheriff remove you, and your possessions will be placed on the curb. I stood up, pushing my leather executive chair back. The soft scrape of the wheels against the floor was the only sound besides Iman's erratic breathing. I reached down and calmly buttoned the center clasp of my tailored suit vest. "Next time you decide to call someone the stain on the family," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls one final time, "make sure you do not owe them money." I turned on my heel. Flanked by David and Marcus, I walked toward the heavy oak doors. I did not pause. I did not hesitate. And as I stepped out into the brightly lit corridor of the high-rise, leaving my family to the ruins of their own making, I never once looked back. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing my family inside the tomb of their own making. That was the last time I ever saw them in a room that they owned. The ensuing months played out like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of consequences. The justice system, blind and unrelenting, moved with terrifying speed. Preston Miller, The golden boy of Atlanta real estate traded his bespoke Italian wool suits for a standard-issue bright orange federal jumpsuit. The local news captured every second of his humiliating perp walk. He looked absolutely pathetic, chained at the wrists and ankles, his head bowed low, as he shuffled into the federal courthouse to face a decade behind bars. Iman did not fare much better. The federal investigation ripped through her life with surgical precision. Because Preston had arrogantly funneled a portion of the stolen funds through their joint accounts, she was dragged directly into the blast zone. I watched from afar as the State Bar Association convened an emergency disciplinary hearing. My sister, who had spent her entire life looking down her nose at my ambition, wept openly as they officially stripped her of her license to practice law. She was left with nothing legally barred from her profession and drowning in the millions of dollars of restitution her husband owed. But the most spectacular collapse belonged to my parents. With Obsidian Capital executing the eviction and freezing their remaining assets to cover the collateral deficit, Elijah and Yvonne Marcus were forcefully removed from the Cascade Mansion. The mighty patriarch and his high society queen were reduced to hauling cheap taped-up cardboard boxes into a cramped, dingy two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. I received pictures from my security team showing Yvonne struggling up a flight of cracked concrete stairs, hiding her face behind oversized sunglasses. A group of women from her former elite church congregation happened to be walking past. They did not stop to help. They just whispered, pointed, and watched the great Yvonne Marcus carry her own garbage bags. Their pride, their ultimate currency, was utterly decimated. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs. I stood on the expansive wrap-around balcony of my penthouse, holding a crystal glass of full-bodied Cabernet. The glass walls of the suite reflected the warm amber glow of the interior lighting, but my attention was entirely focused outward. Beneath my feet, the glittering, sprawling skyline of Atlanta stretched out in every direction. It was a city of power, a city of wealth, and tonight it was a city that I functionally owned. The Legacy building was already slated for demolition, soon to be reborn as an incubation hub for Black female entrepreneurs. A sharp, persistent vibration shattered the quiet ambiance. My sleek smartphone sat on the glass patio table. The screen illuminated the darkness, flashing with an incoming call. Mom. I slowly lowered my wine glass and stepped toward the table. I stared at the name glowing on the screen, feeling the absolute absence of guilt, obligation, or sorrow. For my entire life, that name had demanded my submission. It had demanded my silence and my tears. I reached out. My finger hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second before pressing down with absolute finality. Decline and block. The screen immediately went black, plunging the balcony back into peaceful, uninterrupted silence. I picked up my wine and stepped back to the railing. I turned my head, looking directly into the camera lens, claiming my space at the top of the world. I allowed a slow, razor-sharp smirk to spread across my face. The screen fades to black.